This video is sponsored by thingpenguin.com. Jack, I'm now recording. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, perfect.
I'm with Jack Miller from, you call it if I say Cape Independence Party, is that the right way to put it? Or how do you officially?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're the Cape Independence Party, and our abbreviation is Cape Exit.
Okay, great. That's good. I love those exits because I'm Dave Ridley with NHexit.com, aka
Nice.
ridleyreport.com. Um, and I'm with Jack Miller from South Africa, who's part of an independence movement in South Africa that I feel I think has been doing some things that we could learn from in New Hampshire. Uh, and Jack, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. I listened to some podcasts that I believe I believe this was you, and I just was listening while I was driving, so I just got some basics. But as I understood it, at the Cape, sort of secession movement in South Africa, you've been following a process that I think we could learn from in New Hampshire, and that is a method, series of methods that you've used to engage with the central government at Pretoria, the African National Congress, currently in power, I believe. And uh, can you tell me exactly how you engage with them and how you try to take your case to the entire world for Cape independence?
Well, look, Dave, to be frank, it's something that's naturally unfolded over time. As I was, thinking about your questions to me when you sent me that email, I was actually thinking about the American political system as opposed to the political system that we have here in South Africa. And I think there's some points I'll touch on later where there are similarities, but there are differences, which I'll give my 2 cents worth, and hopefully it can be of some help to you. Um, with regards to the ANC being the ruling governing party of South Africa, and they've been the ruling party for the last 30 years, I think what's been most important for us is that secession it can be quite a scary concept for people. And if you just come out of the blue, it's very important to frame your arguments correctly and to not be perceived, because the mainstream media and those who are opposed to secession, the first thing they're going to try to do is paint you to be an extremist or a nutcase. And it's first of all, we aren't that. We're actually we're a collection of people that are incredibly focused on law and legal premises. Many people are entrepreneurs, business people. These are not nutcases that woke up one day and thought that Cape Independence was a good idea. These are people that have lived in the real world, that understand the legal system, that understand business, that realize how we are suffering under the political and economic system under the ANC government in South Africa. So it's important to get your ducks in a row and make sure that your legal foundations are airtight. So when we started 17 years ago, we put together a very clear manifesto based upon both the South African Constitution, which you can basically call the ANC Constitution because they put it in place in 1996. But South Africa is also a signatory to the United Nations. And as a result of that, it's important to take those charters into account too. So to answer your question, we've taken the aspects of the South African or ANC driven constitution in conjunction with the legal charters of the United Nations to develop our case for why we want the Cape to be an independent country. And I think the fact that we did that from the beginning and presented ourselves in, we like to believe, a fairly level-headed and rational and yeah, legitimate movement. I think we've developed relationships with both the local political forces as well as international political forces that see us for what we are, as a serious independence movement, a self-determination movement. And I like to use that word self-determination because it covers quite a broad spectrum. And I think having a spectrum when you are a secessionist is important because at the end of the day, you're dealing with a political system and politics is based upon negotiation. And so it's important to be able to have a spectrum to move along when you address the central power that you're trying to obtain greater freedoms and ultimately independence from. So, yeah, let that perhaps be. I hope that answers your question.
So you had indicated that you were not really doing much directly with the United Nations itself, but you were sort of engaging the world. How does that work?
Okay, so there are probably today there are about 7 different organizations in the Cape that stand for Cape independence. Well, we're the only political party that's been registered for 17 years. We're the only political party that has got 2 seats in government that stands for Cape independence. The other organizations which we are in close contact with and we've got very good working relationships with some others uh, not as much, but the ones we do have very good working relationships with, they have some of them have approached the United Nations and have under certain sections there lodged the case for Cape independence under certain criteria. So in that respect, our different organizations, we work hand in hand to achieve essentially the same goal.
I've gotten the impression that, I'm aware of some of the dangers in South Africa and some of the cruelties of the central government and of factions within the ANC, and uh, but it's I get the feeling from everything I've heard about you that you maybe have been, correct me if I'm being overly generous to the ANC, but I have this feeling you've been treated a little bit more carefully or cautiously than maybe some other political factions in South Africa. Is that correct?
Treated cautiously. What do you mean by that?
Well, I just hear of all the terrible things that, the ANC and some of its factions, not so much the main government, but more like wings of the ANC, some of the dangers that they pose to freedom in South Africa. Um, and it just sounds really scary. And you'd almost think a secession movement would get targeted and rubbed out, but it doesn't seem like that's happened to you. Am I describing the situation accurately?
Yes, I think you are, and I think there's a number of different reasons for that. And the detail of our situation is important, I suppose, to understand that. So South Africa is quite a vast country, and we are based here in the most southwestern part of the country, the Cape, and we're a very, very different. We're I mean, one of the fundamental reasons behind our secession is we're very different to other parts of South Africa. And we don't have the same types of, I suppose, political instability here in the Cape as you will see in other parts of the country, where political, yeah, uprisings, you get factions that can be quite militant in the way that they approach things here in the Cape. Yeah, we're certain we've always been a little bit more level-headed, even-handed when it comes to politics. And I think that's another part of the reason why we want to secede, because we've got a different value system. We've got a different way of approaching politics to other parts of South Africa. Our demographics is very different here. So we don't resort to violent means to achieve our goals. We use the legal political mechanisms to put forward our case, and we've been very open from the beginning that we understand the complexities of South Africa, and we wish to enter into reasonable negotiations with the central government over our secession. And we understand that some compromises might have to be made, and I think that's something our approach has been appreciated, considering how out of the box it might be for some people. It's been appreciated, and I suppose we do have a certain level of decorum and respect that we get in South Africa as a result of that.
So in New Hampshire, first of all, had you ever heard of the New Hampshire independence movement before you joined the conference in September with
Yeah, I
Milei and
said
Russell County?
yes, I certainly have personally. Yeah, New Hampshire, I think you guys have had a strong libertarian movement. So there were a number of libertarians that moved to New Hampshire. Don't you guys have the Free State Project?
Yes. So you'd heard of that. Had you heard of the New Hampshire Independence Drive?
Loosely, yes.
Okay. It's always just interesting to see whether anyone knows we exist. The did you get any sense at all? So what we've done, I think we have this saying among the Free Staters that we kind of don't know what we're doing. We just admit it and just move forward anyway, like a bumblebee doesn't know it can't fly. Uh, but, but the uh, I was just wondering if you picked up on enough of what we had done, if you'd picked up on any mistakes. For example, I think you know, what we did was it was just kind of to go straight for legislation, right? We didn't like form a bunch of relationships or do anything complicated, and we just went for it. And I'm just wondering if you perceived any mistakes in what you may have heard of that we've done or not done.
Um, I think perhaps the best way for me to answer that is rather look at the movements in your vicinity that have perhaps been the most successful and identify why I think that happens to be the case. I think Quebec is a good example that's on your borders, and then obviously Texas is close to you too. And I think that it's important to perhaps the Free State movement has been almost too libertarian in its approach. In that I don't know how hard you guys have pushed to penetrate the political system itself and use those mechanisms to try and steer it in the direction of a referendum on secession, where I feel like Quebec Quebec harnessed obviously the French speaking language and the political system and tax injustices and cultural injustices to push their agenda and and Texas, where I think Texas has been very effective too, and this is something I wanted to suggest for New Hampshire, is to develop and perhaps you guys are halfway there, if not more, by developing a voting bloc that so the problem here in South Africa is, or benefit or problem, is that so you guys have a first past the post electoral system. We have a proportional representation electoral system, but in spite of that, we still have two dominant parties, the ANC and the DA. Both of those parties are problems for us. The ANC is a problem for us on the national level, and the DA is a problem for us on the provincial level, because neither of them are in favor of Western Cape secession. Um, one less so than the other. But the key there is both of these political entities, the ANC on a national level had a majority up until this last election, and the DA has had a majority here in the Western Cape, which is the most important province for us. It's the crux of our independence movement. They're sitting at 55% currently. We have to get them at 49 or 48 or 47. Once we've got them there, then we as an independent, as a voting bloc, we can then leverage that power that we have to influence the largest party to push for a referendum. So I think that the Texas independence movement has been very successful in forming such a big voting bloc in Texas that they forced governors like Rick Perry and Greg Abbott to basically push secession on a federal level. And I think that's what's given Texas has probably got I would say of all the states in America, Texas probably has the biggest international profile. And I would say that's probably because the Texas secession movement has leveraged I would suppose the Republican Party and made sure that the candidates that they have and the governors that they have are open to secession. Otherwise, they might lose that voting block. So that's something that the New Hampshire movement might be able to do to put pressure on the either the Democrats or the Republicans, and basically say you're going to move your voting block to one or the other, depending on how open they are to a referendum on secession.
Yes, I think your assessment is probably correct, and I think if you want to call it a criticism, I think your criticism is probably also accurate. It mirrors something that the Texas nationalist leader said, is that you've got to avoid what he calls the SN or what I call the SNP problem, where the Scottish National Party convoluted too many other things into the secession movement. They made secession about more than secession, right? Or it wasn't really
Mm.
even secession, independence, whatever it was, because they weren't trying to unilaterally secede or anything. It was just independence for Scotland, and they let the Scottish National Party platform get get conflated with independence itself, and so when they had their referendum, it became a referendum on SNP policy, which is just too complicated. You can't get everyone behind the entire SNP platform. And it's probably the same thing that inadvertently happened to us with our independence movement. It's conflated with the Free State agenda, and it's not broad. I think that's the problem that we have, and I don't know how to broaden it, because when I reach out, if I reach out to any Democrat, they just don't want to talk to me, I'm pretty centrist, right? And it's even worse for other free staters that have even more trouble talking to Democrats. I think we're tied up in one political party and can't escape, it seems like.
How tight is it between the Democrats and the Republicans in New Hampshire?
You mean how close?
Yeah.
The ratios? Well, traditionally we're, a very purple state, which means that we're very closely divided between Republicans and Democrats. Normally, that's a good thing, but over time, what has happened is that Republicans have been pretty welcoming to free staters and libertarians, and even to some extent to independents. But the Democrats have been absolutely hostile. I mean, in the form of, being assaulted more often by Democrats than by Republicans, even in peaceful New Hampshire, right? So, so we've definitely, although we've tried to interact and be part of the Democratic Party and let them be part of us, they just don't like us, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's where you can put your leverage over the Republicans then, and just build such a big voting bloc amongst the free staters there that the Republican candidates know that they need to lean in your direction. Otherwise, they're not going to be elected. And then ideally, you want to get your own candidate into probably the Republican Party then. We know, well, I know that independents really struggle in the States. The amount of money that you need to put together, it's a two-party system you guys have there. We have our own problems here, but yeah, I would say that, similar to Ron Paul running as a Republican, um, and I mean, you look at Trump, he's not your conventional Republican either. I would say that that would probably be the best angle of attack you guys could use, is to get a proper free stater into the Republican Party, and just try drive that candidate as high as you can.
Yeah, I don't, or that's yeah, that part has not been a problem. I mean, we have, depending on how you count them, we have somewhere between 20 and 40 full-blown free staters in the New Hampshire legislature, and many others who are libertarian leaning, or I guess the independence drive itself, the independence legislation achieved, I guess it would have been 20, what was it, 24 votes in the New Hampshire House in favor of keeping that independence legislation alive. That's only fine. I guess that's only constitutes about a little over six, I guess about 6% of the House members, so it's not a large percentage, but we had the power to get on the board. We didn't have the power to get big on the board, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean that's not a bad result. That's nothing to be ashamed of. 6% definitely nothing to be laughed at. Um, what are the primary motivations behind New Hampshire secession?
For me, it's complicated. I'm sort of you could call me the instigator, but maybe I'm just one, in another sense, I'm just one of the instigators. But just speaking for myself, it's just the guy that runs NHexit.com and doesn't speak for all the others. Um, the, for, I've felt like it should be we should just make it a Rorschach check test. Don't try to make it about anything in particular. Just independence and let people fill in the gaps themselves, right? Let them decide, oh, yeah, that would mean the federal government can't do fill in the blank. And instead of me saying it's about war or me saying it's about, better access to medical care or something like that, I have my own grievances, but I just tend to let everyone else fill in the blanks. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. I think there's a danger in being too lukewarm and too um yeah, pale. I think but it is a fine balance. You also don't want to come across as too forthright in down one sort of political standpoint, but I I think there are core issues. I mean, we look, finances is always a good one, and it's a key one, certainly for us here in the Cape. We pay so much tax and we're getting so little back, and it's a really clean issue. There's not really anyone that can have an issue with it. So we really lead with that charge. The fact that we're paying 250 billion rand each year and we're getting 50, basically just over, let's say 60 billion rand back. So we're getting robbed absolutely blind here in the Cape. And that's quite a clean issue. So economics is a clean issue. I'm not too sure what the revenue distribution is for New Hampshire, but finances is always a good one. If you guys are putting in more to the federal government than you're getting back, or the way that the revenue that is allocated to New Hampshire, how that's spent, if you yeah, if you guys had control over your own fiscus, then that's obviously a very appealing angle. So it's important to have emotive issues. You need to have some emotive issues. Independence itself is not emotive enough if it's just independence for the sake of independence, because you'll have people like we are here in South Africa. Our biggest sport is pretty much rugby, and we won the Rugby World Cup last year. So we it it's always difficult to it really builds a sense of political cohesion in the country when they can rally behind a particular issue, even though the country's in such a mess. A winning sporting team can sort of change that perspective. So I think it's important to yeah highlight the things which make New Hampshire people unique and different. We certainly have many here in the Cape, um, and uh, and 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 that would I think lift the more you highlight those issues which make New Hampshire special, then your 6% might become a 10, might become a 15, might become a 20%. So I'd have to study the details of the New Hampshire movement more than that. But my understanding is that it's libertarian driven, which is a strong issue. So um, yeah, perhaps talking about war, talking about getting out of the wars and things like that. If you guys have tried those angles, that might lift your support.
Yeah, in practice, what happened was, again, I instigated the 2022 legislation, but that created a sort of a follow-on effect where people just started renewing it by themselves. I never had to do anything much after that myself, and it started a process, and so the 2024 legislation, a state rep just popped up and he created legislation similar to what you're talking about, where he made it about finance. And he said, instead of our initial legislation in 2022 was just a chance to let the people. It was a constitutional amendment that everyone would eventually have to vote on if it passed the House and Senate. It would have triggered a general vote up or down by the electorate, and it was just on independence. It didn't explain why. And in 2024, the follow-up legislation was the same, except it added a provision that if the debt reached a certain point, the national debt, the federal debt, then we would declare independence. And so it now has, whether I wanted it to or not, it now has automatically tied itself to finances, just to kind of like you suggested.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's what is that number and how far away are you guys from achieving it?
Oh, I'm sure we'll be achieving it in minutes. The federal government debt is currently about 35 trillion, and Jason Gerhard, Representative Gerhard's legislation named, I guess he suggested 40 trillion, and the legislation names 40 trillion as the maximum debt that we would allow the federal government to reach before declaring independence. But of course, his legislation was shot down before it even got in front of the voters, if that makes sense.
Oh, so that didn't pass.
Correct, and it won't pass in 2026 either, I bet. But you know how it is. If you look at the precedents in Estonia, Bosnia, Slovenia, places like that, independence has a way of going from 0 to 60 in seconds almost, because
Mm.
the federal governments, the central governments will go bad so fast
Yeah.
uh, that it blindsides you, and suddenly you're independent and you weren't ready for it.
Exactly, exactly. And that was one of the points I was going to share with you today is it's just and that's something that I learned the hard way. I mean, I started the Cape Independence Party in 2007. So I've been doing this 17 years, and when I started it, my belief was that we would have to achieve Cape independence within 5 years, otherwise it wasn't possible. And 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 we went about it in such a way that it needed to be done within 5 years. But now, 17 years later, you learn a lot from life. You learn a lot from the political system. You understand the electorate. You understand the way that people vote, their reasons for voting, complacency, the inertia, the natural inertia of the status quo. These are very difficult things to overcome. But like you said, there comes a time, and I think this is the key point, is it's time on the field, and we've been here 17 years, and I think that, to go right back to your first question, that is probably a big reason why we have, I would say, good working relationships with almost all of the other political parties in South Africa. Some obviously are a bit difficult to work with, but in general, we've been around so long that we're a known entity. People know who we are. They know what we stand for. We're consistent. We are persistent, and I think that we will find that there will come a point in the future when all of those factors which drive the reasons behind forming the Cape Independence Party, when those factors become so glaring and so unavoidable, that is when you'll see us go from having 2 seats in government to having, whatever the number we need to tip the balance of power in favor of a referendum, and that could happen in a very short period of time. For example, in 2021, in July, we had an extreme event that happened here in South Africa, where one part of the country, which is predominantly the Zulu tribe, they were very unhappy with some of the political ongoings in the ANC against one of their tribal and political leaders, and former president Jacob Zuma. And it resulted in a massive, massive uprising where, I mean, yeah, just cities were almost burning down. It just shopping centers were burning down. People were in the streets with spears and machetes. it was insane, and it had this knock-on effect through the whole of the country, where you had, yeah, people in panic running into shopping centers trying to get the last bit of toilet paper, worrying that all the resources are going to run out because the trucks were being burnt down and things like that. And all it takes is just something like that, and it can happen out of nowhere. And I think that's where we stand here in South Africa. We're at that cusp. Things can really kick off at any point in this country because there's so many areas of discontent. And I suppose it's from what you told me now, you guys are very well positioned. That's a smart bill to put forward, that when the national debt gets to a certain point, that you trigger, if not independence, at least a referendum on independence. That's a very smart card to play. So if I were you guys, I'd probably just keep on playing that card. And how many New Hampshire voters are aware of that bill? I mean, was that well publicized?
Yeah, yes. In fact, I would say that, we were almost aiming more for national publicity or world publicity in 2022 than we were aiming for any kind of progress on independence because it was for us, it was sort of just an end run around the internet censorship because we were not able, people were starting to ignore us, and we just thought, well, just need to do something peaceful but very interesting that will drag the media to force the media to talk about us, and it was very successful at that. But we knew it wasn't going to go very far, in terms of actually getting us towards independence. And that was pretty much how it played out. But in practice, it did create it sparked something that has been growing every couple of years, that really is taking us a little bit closer towards independence. Um, and so yes, it triggered a lot of publicity basically inside New Hampshire. So we kind of failed to get this as much world publicity as we would have wanted, but we got plenty of local. I mean, almost everyone in New Hampshire seems to have heard about this, or at least inside the political process. The governor had to talk about it publicly, and all kinds of people felt like they had to come forward and denounce it or repeat the word constitutional scholar for 10 minutes in hearings, just to quash it. You're not allowed to do that because constitutional scholar. So we got, it was designed to get us attacked, and it did. And but it didn't do as much for we didn't trigger as much international publicity as we would have liked.
Yeah, I think it sounds like you guys are on it, and I the old Chinese torture, just drip 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 drip. I think keep at it. It sounds like you got some very smart people driving the movement, and one can get itchy feet and feel like, why isn't this happening sooner? But just stay the course and keep pushing. And I suppose, I mean, I would say that it's not a bad thing to add a bit of color and flavor, and something that people can get their teeth stuck into, exactly like that bill which would trigger secession at 40 trillion debt. Um, Something similar, I suppose, with polling, you can see how do people feel about the wars in Ukraine, and things like that. Emotive topics. Yeah, I'm not too sure what the core issues are with New Hampshire residents, but trying to find those core issues. I think that finance one, if there's anything else in that financial realm, that would probably be a good thing to add to the attack. But yeah, I don't think it's too bad to have some emotive issues, but then obviously keeping them as focused as possible.
Jack, I need to warn you, we're at the 2 minute mark now. I wanted to give you an
Okay.
opportunity to anything important that you wanted to add or tell us about your movement or whatever. Anything that I just haven't asked you yet that you wanted to talk about. And if we get cut off, I just want to thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Dave. Yeah, and I think chats like this are so important. It's important to be seen as taking hands with movements around the world. So if any of your viewers want to go to capeexitparty.com, they can check out who we are, what we stand for, and let's build these bonds further. I think the more relationships we have with independence movements around the world, the stronger we all become.
That's great. So I'm pretty well deplatformed or shadow banned or whatever you want to call it. And so I have 35,000 subscribers who will, basically all not be allowed to see this. But I do still have access to talk radio, and I have a policy of trying to take some of the takeaways from people like you I talk to, and I take them to talk radio. And so this video will probably only get about 100 hits or so, but I will probably be able to reach 100,000 people by talk radio, and I'll try to summarize some of your important points. So when you see this video, it won't look very important, but your message will get out to quite a few people, and I really appreciate you bringing it to me.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's been fantastic chatting to you, and yeah, I look forward to chatting again in the future.
All right, take care, Jack.
You too, Dave.
Okay, bye.
Here's my friend. Bye.
Do you value your privacy? Want hardware that works? Get Linux at New Hampshire's very own thingpenguin.com.